Okay, so, hi, welcome to this workshop. It's a new age for racial justice. I'm Ian, I'll be moderating. I'm a YDSer from UC Davis, and also the student organizer at Davis for ASCII Local 3299, which represents UC workers. Our speakers are Nadia Mohamed. Nadia Mohamed believes in the transformative power of building solidarity across movements. Her work with the Applied Research Center's Network and Training Department, as well as the open, non-hierarchical video collective Paper Tiger TV and the Movement Space Project, a collective effort to co-create a large multi-use movement/activist space in NYC, all support the work of bridging our movements together. You can usually find her making and sharing food with loved ones, running, biking, or producing all sorts of media with her beloved co-conspirators. Patricia Gonzalez-Ramirez is a media maker working towards social and economic justice through activist and community-based projects. A graduate of the New School, she currently works at Paper Tiger Television and as a Spanish interpreter. There's a third speaker, Greg Basta, who is probably going to be late, but hopefully he comes soon. In the meantime, and while they're presenting, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so be sure to think of questions and I'm going to hand it over to them.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Nadia.
I'm Patricia.
So do you want to talk a little bit about Paper Tiger?
Yeah, so we wanted to first talk about the organizations that we are both involved with, the groups, and just an introduction. So we're both part of Paper Tiger, and Paper Tiger Television is a video-based collective that has been going around for over 30 years. It was founded and based by a group of people that wanted to demystify the information in the communications industry. And when it started, the way they approached this was to go for the medium of television and try to make the change what a television show should be. And they did this through public access television when public access television was first since its inception. And throughout the years, of course, the best way I could summarize it is that our collective and the work that we do has changed with technology, which is actually quite relevant to this idea of racial justice that we're going to talk about today. And basically the work that we do has changed as technologies have become more available to people. So before, the only way you could make television was if you actually went to a studio and you rented a studio and you had these 2-camera shows. And as the 80s and then at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, as camcorders and porta packs became more available, then people were able to go out to the streets and shoot and document things like actual movements and things that happen. And that's when I would say Seattle was a big thing, because that's one of the first protests that was massively documented as the way it is. And I'll be happy to talk more about that if anybody has questions. So our collective sort of has followed this trajectory of media activism, and where we are right now is that even though we call ourselves a video collective, we are really a multimedia group of collective of groups with folks from all walks of life, or from different walks of life, that come together because we all have interest in making DIY, radical, or out of activist or political dissent media, usually of voices or topics that are not mainly heard. So that's what Paper Tiger is. We work non-hierarchically consensus-based, and we have open meetings, and everyone's welcome to join, and you get involved by being part of projects and also being part of internal working groups that make our organization function. So.
Yeah, so I'm also part of Paper Tiger. And one of the things that I find interesting about Paper Tiger is that people come into the organization sharing the skills that they already have and also learning new skills. So I came into the collective without video production knowledge, and came out having produced a couple documentaries and shorter form videos. And some of my other work outside of Paper Tiger is with the Applied Research Center, which is a 30-year-old national organization that focuses specifically on racial justice. They do that through media, research, and leadership development. The media outlet is colorlines.com, which is a daily news site that does the news through a racial justice lens, and it gives a face to a lot of these issues that we'll get into a little later today. We also do research. Our recent research report was Shattered Families, which looked at the deportation system and how it's affecting mixed status families, specifically once undocumented parents get deported, their citizen children end up in the child welfare system. We also do leadership development, so that's mostly training and consulting work. Trainings around what racial justice is, and and just focusing on proactive solutions to addressing racial justice problems. So before we get into other things, I wanted to give a little overview of some key concepts. So I wanted to ask kind of if anyone wanted to give a definition of what they think racial justice means.
I think it's an analysis of the previous discrimination and oppression based on racism, but and also trying to seek a society that makes reparations to those injustices. Mm-hmm. So rather than just being post-racial, it's acknowledging it and embracing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great definition. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Okay. Well, one thing I would like to add is just like talking about this word called justice. Like, what does justice mean? Does justice mean, justice does not mean diversity. It doesn't also mean equality. It means equity, which is fairness. So how do we so racial justice would then mean creating systems and policies and practices that provide equal opportunities and equal outcomes, not only opportunities, but outcomes, looking at how people are actually impacted by practices. So racial justice then would be like the proactive creation and reinforcement of those policies and practices that give people equal opportunity and equal access and outcomes to any sort of issue. So I guess we could talk a little bit about like the role of racial justice and community media.
Yeah, I mean the best way to link this is the fact that community media and independent based media has consistently provided a space and a voice for folks whose stories are often not acknowledged, including the structural racism that affects society, to have an outlet. That's the simple way to put it. And I think aside from that is also the fact that the way that even if stories about that might highlight the racial injustices of our society do get into the mainstream media, we have to think about how they made it there, and what is the narrative, what is the tone, and how is being said. And oftentimes it is not really true, or not even true, but it was very minimalizing of the whole scope of what a person could say through their own voice. So I think the importance of community media is that it has consistently, not only throughout this idea of attaining racial justice, but also through gender, immigrant rights, and other liberation movements, it has consistently provided a space to let people bring that forth. And the important thing to highlight of community media is that the way we do it, or the way that a lot of people that have been longtime advocates, is that you really put the tools and the mediums in the people's hands, and you should be allowed to create the media just as you see it. It's the way that you can really speak about it. So when we talk about the difference between independent media and community media, is that oftentimes you can have independent media with folks that are outside of communities, and that I'm not saying that's not important and that's not relevant. I think it's really important to have documentarians and folks that definitely are trained to do this, to come and do pieces about other folks that definitely haven't been their stories haven't been heard. But there is something very more key and powerful in having folks produce their own work, even if it's not the way we think about it in the most professional or slipping on my words here, Nadia, but the more professional, the more way that media should be seen.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would add just the idea that how we frame stories has more implications because it actually also frames policy. So think of like how the mainstream media covers undocumented people. They call them illegal aliens, and then what does that lead to? That leads to record numbers of deportation, families split apart, like all of these other things. So the power of like how we tell stories and how we analyze them is actually really measurable in those kinds of ways. Like it actually affects people's lives and how they experience this country and society in general. So I think we're going to move into showing, well, we're not going to show it just yet, but I wanted to sort of go into an example of like race in the restaurant industry. We've been doing some work at the Applied Research Center looking at low-wage workers and how the racial implications of low-wage work. And Paper Tiger also has recently produced, in conjunction with the Fast Food Workers Campaign, a couple of short videos. So I just wanted to share a little bit about like the racial implications of the restaurant industry. So it's the second largest private industry. It's also one of the most unregulated industries. It has 2 of the 7 most lowest paid jobs, and just workers generally experience lots of abuse. There's no paid sick days. The minimum wage is $2.13 for federal. Like the federal minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.13. A lot of time wages are stolen. There's job segregation within the restaurant industry, so a lot of the back of the house jobs are mainly for people of color, and it's hard for them to move within into the front of the house jobs, which are the higher paid jobs and the jobs where you can most likely make a living wage, but not all the time, depending on where that is. Also, because of housing segregation, a lot of those restaurants that could potentially provide living wage jobs are not located in areas where people of color predominantly live. So either they have to travel far or they just don't even have access to those jobs to begin with. And I think that this is an important thing that we should all start, or if we aren't already think about, because I think there's a lot of traction, at least within the mainstream media, about like what sustainable food is and how a lot of times within that conversation there's a silence around race and like the people that are actually producing the food. So how do we already use the traction that people are interested in these ideas and these issues, and also put a race frame to that? So do you want to talk a little bit about the video and Paper Tiger's relationship?
Yeah, so we're gonna show us a short video, and the video we got outreach by the folks that were organizing the Fast Food Forward campaign before it came about, and what they wanted to do, and this is where the community media part comes in. It's like they, of course they had their New York Times person that was going to publish the article like the night before, and they had all these like professional journalists that they knew there was something going to happen. But they didn't know what day or when was going to happen. But what these folks did, the organizers, which was really important, is that they outreach community media and independent media makers. And what they wanted to do with that is make sure that the documentation of the stories were covered in all ways. Were covered from I, for example, 2 weeks, a week and a half before the actual strike happened on November 29th, I was running all over the city, doing interviews, just really straightforward, just camcorder interviews with some of the workers that were going to strike, and documenting those before those folks even went out to speak to mainstream media, a week and a half later during the strike and everything. And the importance of that is, first of all, those documenting those, it's different when you do it as a community media maker than the kinds of questions and the kinds of profiles that professional journalists for these main newspapers often take. And it's very important to capture those stories before they go through the scrutiny of the mainstream media. For example, we're not going to see it here because it's not one of the stories that we documented, but it's very interesting. One of the workers that went on strike, I was able to go to his single bedroom occupancy where he lives, and we had a 40-minute interview in Spanish, and it was in-depth, lengthy interview. That excerpts were used for the campaign later, but now we also have that interview for documentation purposes. And the way that worker spoke and the way that worker's voice came about was very, very different when the mainstream media covered his story or him as one of the subjects of the strike a week and a half later. And of course, there's both ways, and you can look at both interviews, and you can read the article and look at the original tape we produced before the strike, and you can notice that. Of course, not everybody's going to do that, and not everybody has access to these tapes and this documentation. But it's really interesting, especially when you talk about how you frame stories and how do you creatively build and organize and make people not get beaten up by what comes out later on. So what we're gonna show here is the day of the strike. We were in Brooklyn. We were in many places because all the independent media makers went to different sites. But I was particularly placed in Brooklyn, and we were able to talk to a few workers. And this is Trevon's story, and I would tell you more if you have any questions.
I worked at the Wendy's on 291 in Livingston. I worked the clothing shift 5 nights a week. Now, it consists of cleaning 4 grills, dumping oil in the basement, scrubbing floors, mopping floors. And it's times where someone will call out because they weren't able to get here, they had to babysit children. And I would close my station and their station. But I'm only getting paid for one person. Give me my wages. Give me my wages. Hands off my money. Hands off my money. Hands off my money. Hands off my money. This is 2012. This is 2012. Not 1812. Not 1812. This is 2012. This is 2012. Not 1912. Not 1912. Give me my money. Give me my money. My weekly pay working, this is 41 hours. This is overtime, $255. And that's if I can get 41 hours. Sometimes I get 36 hours, 32 hours. Altogether, I make about $1,000 a month. My rent is $750. Well, my rent was $750. I have a cell phone bill, $50 a month, and I have to get a Metro card for 4 weeks. So when it comes down to it, I don't have much to spend for food. I'm still not surviving. I still have to borrow money here and there, just for coffee and lunch. They actually charge us to eat there. I live in Far Rockaway. It takes me about an hour and a half, hour, 45 minutes to get out here. And I was recently caught in Superstorm Sandy. My whole house is completely destroyed. I'm staying at different family members' homes, hotels here and there. Now when I came to Wendy's and I let them know what happened, all they offered me was a free meal, no pay, nothing. No leave of absence, anything. They just offered me a free meal. Now they tell me to call when I'm able to work. Then when I call to work, they say I'm not fired, but they're quote unquote looking for hours for me. Give me my money. Give me my money. Give me my money. Give me my money. Can't have my labor. Can't have my labor. No cheap wage. No cheap wage. Give me my money. Give me my money. Give me my money. Give me my money. So basically what I'm out here doing, I'm speaking to everybody, whether you make minimum wage or you have a job that's paying more than that, you have a union. This is for the people that's after us. This is for your children. This is for your family members, your friends. Stand up and fight, because if we don't stand up and fight, we're giving them the assumption that it's all right to treat us like this. Minimum wage has got to go. Minimum wage has got to go.
So, I mean, looking at that and also thinking, back to what Nadia was saying at the beginning, I think it's really, really important to understand that we see like media and racial justice as something like the diversity of tactics in a way, or a way that the work that, for example, a think tank or these research-based work. And this sort of very, short DIY community-based videos or whatever other tweeting, collective tweeting that might happen. There's all, like I said, there's all these mediums and tactics. They should all be seen as, you know, as in conjunction to advancing struggles that, of course, pertain to like racial justice and workers' right and economic justice in general. And I think what I want to bring out of you know, point out of everything we've talked. Is that you know, that when we talk about community media, or we talk about people being in power, is really having access to all these ideas that make up how we communicate and we transmit information and how we advance like policies and the voices of the people in the community. And there's many things where we can bring into this. You know, that we can talk about the digital divide, for example, and the implications of racial justice and that, and of course how that pertains to workers' right and all these other things. But that's like a really long workshop that we will need to do. Do you have anything? I'm not sure. Do you have anything else to?
I'd like to bring Greg if he's ready to share.
Sure. And apologies for my lateness. Fell victim to the weekend train schedule. So, I mean, you know, when I was asked to speak here, it was pretty ironic. I found myself having difficulty figuring out what I wanted to talk about because it was you know, I was asked to talk about the intersection of race and economics, and that's pretty much what me and my organization do on a 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365-day year basis. And I mean, I think I figured that I'd talk about going forward that there's two different sets of problems with regards to institutional racism that we need to tackle. So there's the traditional, what we do discuss, and it is sort of NYCC's platform. We have a sort of Tale of Two Cities platform where we talk about our members, which run the organization, you know, almost 50,000 low-income people of color who make up all our chapters and run the organization, that within this other city, within the city that all these citywide electives are running for, and this vision of this city, it's just this vision of middle class and this vision of like how the middle class need more rights in the city. And then there's the other city, which is just a round-the-clock, 24-hour system of anxiety. There's anxiety when going to work, which for most of our members are fast food places, other low-wage jobs like car washes and grocery stores, where not only are they subjected to paltry minimum wage levels, but they're also, you know, particularly our Latino members at car washes and grocery stores, getting wages illegally withheld and being forced to work overtime and not getting paid for it. So there's that anxiety of not being able to find a better job because of their immigration status or whatever, and then also being totally screwed around with by the powers that be. Picking their kids up from school where they don't know if that school is going to be there because our neighborhoods like Brownsville and Harlem and Far Rockaway are being used as guinea pigs for the corporatization of education, for the Michelle Reese Students First charter school movement, where they're closing down a school of 2,000 to move in a school of 200, and those 200 won't even be kids from the neighborhood. Just using these tests to just, you know, as Rupert Murdoch said, that education is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry just waiting to be tapped into. So that's what it is for them, an industry. And so losing these community institutions of public education, there's that anxiety. And then there's the anxiety of going home to their, dealing with their mortgage, with, you know, in a state like New York State, almost 20% of all homeowners are underwater. And of those homeowners that are underwater, even though people of color only make up 15% of homeowners in New York State, they make up almost 50% of underwater households. And they make up almost 45% of all foreclosures. So you have homeowners that are dealing with the institution of the mortgage system and the banking system. And then you have in the affordable housing ranks, the city and countries actually, like, disinvestment of affordable housing and public housing. You know, the city has a public housing system of 750,000 people. This would be a city larger than Miami if it was its own city, which as you can see for a community organizing group like ours, that makes it kind of tough to organize public housing because it's like organizing another city. But they've already made major cuts to services, to security, to maintenance. You know, if you have mold in your apartment in public housing, you should file a complaint, but be ready to wait on a list of that it's a 12 to 18 month waiting list to get this dealt with. So this constant anxiety of how you're going to live and how you're going to work and how you're going to send your kids to school, where when we just, when you hear people on the right or even moderate Democrats, well, what do we need? We should have a good jobs program. We should get these people training, and it just so freaking misses the point because it's just such a top-down, holistic, lack of equity on all fronts, on education, on housing, and on workplace. And so, I mean, I think going forward, I think a lot of community organizations like ours and labor organizations have really, I think, stepped up to the plate to figure out ways to deal with this. So we have this fast food workers movement. We've, in the last year alone, we've worked to organize 8 different grocery stores and 4 different car washes, and in the last year have reclaimed over $1 million in back wages for these workers that were illegally withheld by their asshole bosses. And I think this stuff is great, and I think we're making some real headway on going after the banks. I actually think there's a groundswell that there's actually going to be some interesting stuff that you're going to see next year, like organizing bank workers and doing things like that, the tellers, the call centers, things like that. That's great. So I think we still know what the problems are, right? Like the institutions that we need to really change fundamentally. But I think there's also the institutions on the left that are a major problem. I think first and foremost that right now I'm a white guy talking to you guys about the intersection of race and economics. I'm fortunate enough to say that I was, I don't mean this as an insult, but I was like the 7th person that we were trying to get from NYCC to come talk to you, so at least I was the 7th, and unfortunately we had all our chapter elections this year, so a lot of our lead organizers couldn't make it. But I mean, this was, I came from Acorn. I could write a whole book of why Acorn was fantastic. I could write a whole book about what the problems were. And one of the real problems were just this management by white men from the top down. And we worked to change that hard in New York, and we've made some great strides. But it's community organizations, labor organizations that talk about this, talk about representation among people of color in the progressive movement and in the left movement, but the people who are saying this and who are making the decisions are still, for the most part, white men. And that's a major problem. And that can't go forward. And again, within what we call the progressive electeds that we have, I mean, the Congressional Progressive Caucus is an oxymoron. It's they've made headway in terms of social progressivism in marriage equality and things like that. But there is one congressman who I'll leave nameless that he uses the term spec to describe most congressional progressives, which is socially progressive, economically conservative. It is so much more of an incentive for their donors and their supporters to leave economics off the table, because the economic issues that we need to address are affecting low-income people of color, are affecting the neighborhoods that we work in. And there is no real representation even among the so-called progressives on the congressional level and the state level. And there's this lack of investment in community organizations that advocate for people of color and that are comprised of people of color. Foundations and progressive donors are going to the move-ons of the world and other online advocacy groups. And there is not this investment for the organizations on the ground that can actually build real power for these communities. So, I mean, we have the clear enemy that, banks, our government, corporate education, institutions like McDonald's and fast food companies that we all know and that we all have to think about better strategies to deal with. But I think there's a lot of cleaning up that we need to do on our side as well. Because, I mean, I think I am really blessed to work for an organization where our members do make the decisions, and I merely just get to have fun trying to figure out strategies that can help us move forward. But there isn't that much. There isn't enough power within our communities to lead this movement.
And so, just so everyone's aware, Greg Basta is the Deputy Director of New York Communities for Change. And of course, Nadia and Patricia represent Paper Tiger TV. Can we get a hand for our speakers? Okay, so I think we'll open up Stack and have 2 questions at a time and then have a discussion.
This is a question, actually I have 2 questions, it's really short though, about the Paper Tiger Initiative. First one was, I'm just curious about the name, the origins of the name, because the only time I've ever heard the term Paper Tiger used was in Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. I don't know if that's a perfect, like, if that's where you, I just want to know, like, where the influence by the name is, if that's it, or if there's something else to it. And the second question is Paper Tiger or any other initiative you know of doing anything for bringing racial, views of racial justice to the forefront of global issues that might not get the right, that they might not show that well enough, especially, like, for instance, getting cameras to people in, like, occupied territory in Palestine, like to take video of what they do at checkpoints, or like other things that people might not be aware of the racial side to it in world issues. And those are my 2 questions.
To your first question, it actually comes from the idea that the paper tiger is a lie. So, it comes from that. It comes from basically the communications industry is a lie. It's a paper tiger. So it's called Paper Tiger Television. So that's actually where the name comes from, and I'm going to talk about, definitely there is a global initiative of independent community-based media makers that definitely believe that putting cameras or putting the tools in the hands of the folks that are that are facing global issues that pertain to race, like in occupied Palestine, is definitely happening. Well, we don't do that. We collaborate, or we definitely, for example, one of our members just came back from the delegation, the American delegation to Gaza, that just went in December after the Operation Pillar of Defense attack that happened 2 months ago. So and she was documenting it, from her perspective, but there are definitely folks that have been doing that. There's a few films that have come out. There's this film called 5 Broken Cameras. I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. There's also one of our, we know her because through Deep Dish Television, but there's this filmmaker called Fida Kishta. You can write her name, is Quishta. She is journalist and a filmmaker, and she's Palestinian from Gaza, and she documented her life for the past 5 years living there, and she has just come out with her film, and definitely independent media and community-based media organizations like Deep Dish Television and Paper Tiger and other folks have definitely supported her in that effort. So yeah, so there's definitely folks out there in this realm doing that work. Going back to, I wanted to mention a little bit. Do you have anything to add? I want to go in if you want. Going back to something that Greg was talking about, having these radical or like leftist organizations run by white men. I definitely think there is one of the most powerful experiences, or one of the most powerful things about really putting other tools in the hands of the folks to create media or to do organizing. And this is something that I think Paper Tiger has done quite well. I mean, with its flaws, nothing's perfect with throughout the years. But if you look at the trajectory of Paper Tiger has been mostly a very, very strong group of women, and has allowed a lot of people of color to take the reins of making media, and tons of folks of color that went through Paper Tiger are now doing like great journalism and other kinds of work or education work out there. And it was definitely, if you look at it, a lot of people associate Paper Tiger with women, even though it's not like a women's group, it's like an open collective. But the reason why this happens, and this is going back to what Greg was saying, it's like when you create structures, and when I'm talking about structure, I'm talking about like a non-hierarchical collective structure where people who usually can't work and can't function in the traditional hierarchical organizations that the left reproduces for organizing. This is what happens when you create those different models, when you create those different structures. Those people flourish, and those communities, like individuals, are able to really, really take on really amazing work. And this is just an example of a really small, volunteer-based video collective. But you can also think about what if all these organizations that are doing, you know, the really progressive, radical organizing around the city were run with a different, you know, model? And I think looking at membership models, looking at like consensus-based organizations with no board of directors, you know, when you look at those things, what does that mean really for a progressive movement? So that's something also to think about.
Maybe to stack 1, 2.
So you guys all work with people in communities that have been sort of like traditionally portrayed by like big media and portrayed like not in a way that they might choose to, like restaurant workers and people who have like precarious documentation situations. How do you bridge that gap of like creating a space where people feel okay talking to you and like telling their stories, not feeling like it's going to be something that is going to be like harmful to them or their families or their job situation?
So I think it's an inside-outside strategy. I mean, I think you know, we're really excited to see community media grow, and we're like, this is something that, you know, I don't know, some of you might have seen Sarah Jaffe speak earlier, but like meeting with folks like Sarah Jaffe and connecting them with our work, and you know, a lot of her friends in media that are, you know, have really been the driving force, and you know, this work has been the driving force in the fast food campaigns, and we're really happy about that. As you said, like we had the New York Times piece, and we have to have that, but the stuff that really got people really fired up was the community media. It wasn't the mainstream. But I think we, you know, if we're gonna really get these stories out there right now in the short term, I think we need to do a better job addressing how we can sort of game the mainstream media system. I think we've had success. We've been working with like more traditional media, like sort of media trainers to work with our members to like, you know, where we sort of, I mean, it's, you know, that's part of the problem, right? Is that like, you know, every person that goes on from like these national online advocacy groups, they have a PR trainer that gets them prepared to deal with media. Membership-based organizations, most unions don't have that. But we are putting an investment in that so that our members can go on. And if you watch these reporters try to do subtly, or maybe not so subtly, racist moves, like try to put the onus on them about their job, they're ready to go right back and make the reporter look foolish, and I think we've gotten a lot better. So I think we do that in the short term, but we do build this independent community media that is just way more supportive and way more honest, that we would much rather have as being, you know, the norm rather than something that's an alternative.
I guess kind of going back to some theory behind the work that you were talking about. So I work as a reporter, and I also do some like youth action research facilitation. And I guess more so in the first case, for me, I always feel this tension between, particularly just like as a white dude, feel this tension between providing a platform for people's voices on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, reifying or like solidifying their voices in a way that kind of captures them without really sort of, you know, that, you know, in a way that is negative. If that makes any sense, I guess I wonder, is that a tension that any of you experience in your media work? And if so, like, how do you navigate that?
Asking me as a person of color, or like as just at my work?
As a media organizer.
Okay.
I mean, I think part of it has to do with the story that you're trying to tell and the questions that you ask. So I think asking questions that are elicitive and give the person the space to tell their story is probably one of the ways that you can avoid having those issues. But I think involving them, are you a writer or a media producer? So involving them in the process, at least like showing them drafts of what you're planning to show, makes them at least feel included, if that's ever possible in the work that you do. We try to do that with the work that we do whenever possible. It's not always possible, but I think a lot of times creating that sense of trust comes from how you approach people and the questions that you ask, and giving them a sense of like what your intention is behind writing this piece or producing this piece of media. So I think that's been my experience generally.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned that. Nadia has been involved in this project. It's a feature-length documentary, or not documentary, but piece, research-based piece.
Yeah.
About Detroit, and the piece has taken 2 years to complete, and it's finally being completed, hopefully soon. And people are, why has it taken you? You know, it's kind of like thinking it's like kind of slow media in a way. It's like, think about fast food, slow food movement, fast media. Think about it as also slow media kind of movement. And what these collective structures of, and really working with not just going there and shooting and editing, like just like working with people to create media, it sometimes takes time, and it sometimes takes, like, it doesn't follow the norm of how the world wants us to consume things. And what has happened with this piece is, like, yeah, it's been re-edited like 4 times, because they have gone back to Detroit 3 times at least, right? Mm-hmm. 3 times at least, to share the rough cuts with the people that were interviewed, and with the community in Detroit that is being addressed in the piece. A traditional filmmaker and a big company will never ever allow anyone to do that, because time is money, and you need to put things out there, and you need to like hit the theaters and buy some DVDs, you know. But when you do this work, really thinking about like trying to really change the system, that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to step back and say, this is going to take a while, or this is not going to be how everybody does these things, but we're going to do it this way. And what are the opportunities that we're creating with this? We're creating people to not just give a voice in the most superficial kind of way. We're really talking about making people participants in the process of change. And and if you think about it, whatever community liberation or like economic justice or whatever it is, and that's really, really important to think about.
I think if we could take 2 more questions, 1, 2.
So my question is, I'm really interested in the way you've discussed both having an organizational, somewhat institutional, hierarchical structure with NYCC, and also this more autonomous, non-horizontal media collective. And I wonder if there were any conflicts in that. The horizontal media collective is going to be breaking away from the reins of the messaging that maybe some of the staff in NYCC would want, or did you have no conflicts? That almost sounds like it's kind of, that it would have those conflicts in the power dynamics of where the movements, groups should go.
I mean, I feel like from my perspective, where independent and community media has been covering our work, it's been about the work that our members are doing, and so that's the connecting tissue. It's not so much about the separate hierarchies, but it is about it's about Truvon, it's about Pamela Flood and all these workers that are out there doing this work. So I mean, I think on that similar on a similar note for us, real quick, where we were sort of in the middle of the labor community collaboration with Occupy, and that was, there'd be tension. I don't think it was never like make or break tension, because again, we were all on the same page on some of the issues. Some of it was maybe what's the tactic and what do we do, but at the end of the day, the goals and the values were very much aligned, and in a way that I think a lot of entities and community organizations had never worked before.
Last question.
I don't mean to be a bother or to bust anybody's chops, but in a way, there's this new age media coming up. There's a change in the media field, whereas in DVDs, Blu-ray discs are obsolete, and the way you can say books and libraries are obsolete, blockbusters are closing down. Satellite television, cable TV, files is confounded and suffering from cognitive dissonance, and this new age media that we're about to participate in, where everything is downloaded into electronic devices, and it's all stored in a database rather than be inventory, and rather than be as a physical substance, it's a file. How do you address this new age media, this change in the media field?
I want to go talk about digital divide.
You can.
We both know about it, but
I think you can.
I feel like I talk more.
It's okay.
this is actually something that does pertain to racial justice and in the future of the work of organizing. If you think about it, these new technologies and these new things, we have to think about who has access to them and to what cost is coming to people. This is why having Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, for example, and having access to, for example, connecting to the internet, it is a racial justice issue, and it is an economic justice issue, and oftentimes, I mean, it is now being picked up, but oftentimes, before it wasn't. And how, in thinking about that, what does that mean in the way how people access information, who gets to access what, and what does it mean when folks are accessing the traditional old media, what gets on television and what gets on whoever has a really nice iPhone with all these RSS feeds and all these tools and apps and all these things, so it comes down to, again, a racial and economic justice, and how do we bridge that? So it's the future. I think it's like sort of the future of the conversation of racial and economic justice and technology. So
do the speakers have any last statements they'd like to make? Can we get a hand for our speakers?